You're probably thinking, Ashley, what are we doing outside in the cold? Well, I'm here today to talk to you about steel garden beds. And we're gonna go through, sadly enough, despite the snow outdoors, right now kind of is the time to buy your steel beds, to get everything planned and ready to go so that when it does begin to melt, you can install those steel beds outdoors. And behind me is my front yard garden that I'm starting to add more and more steel garden beds to. And Vigo actually sent me one of their steel beds, so that is one that is going to be going in the front here. But what are just some things you want to look for in a bed? Does Vigo check the boxes? Does Sprout Box check the boxes? And I even have some Princess Auto ones, no-name ones that I also keep in my front yard. So we're going to break down all the specifics of raised garden beds, what kind of supports you should look for. Should you go for a short? Should you go for a tall? Is there something you should be looking for to determine if it's toxic or not? You name it, we're going to talk about it. It's actually kind of nice out. It's not melting, but like it is definitely t-shirt weather. Despite seeing my breath, I swear it's t-shirt weather, I promise you. Okay, so first one is my Princess Auto specials. Obviously, they're completely covered, but these guys actually last very nicely. These guys have had for about 3 years. They're not bending, they're not warping. And the reason for that, I do believe, is kind of these slotted corners that are not perfect squares. They're almost, it's kind of octagon-ish type bed. And also the fact that the sidewalls are short means it doesn't bow in. So the next one I was hoping to show you, I was hoping not to be covered with stuff, but my husband usually takes over the backyard when I'm not present to say, don't put this there, don't put that. So we have some wood stacked on it, but I am gonna show you something. And this is one thing I don't like about some raised beds. It is this, the dreaded bowing out. Now, I'm not sure how well you can see it on camera, but this is the Sprout Box and it is definitely bowing kind of in the middle section. My dogs are literally running laps, so my camera is in a very precarious position with the zoomies right now. So the reason I think that Sprout Box is beginning to bow in the middle is because it doesn't have any center supports kind of pulling the sides in. And this is not exclusive to just aluminum or steel raised beds. I actually see this really commonly with wood ones as well. So my wood beds also do this. Any bed that doesn't have a center support, that is too long in structure, tends to bow out as the soil, pressure on the soil pushes it out. I almost got knocked over there. Now this is probably more common in a climate like what we're here in Canada, zone 3, that gets a ton of snow. The snow you see behind me is mild. We've had this come and go about 5 times, which is not the norm for us. Typically this entire backyard is just snow banks galore. So the pressure of the snow, water, animals, unfortunately, children, or even you manipulating, putting mulch on, adding to, all that pressure slowly begins to pull the sides out. Now, the Sprout Box by no means is broken. It still, of course, will allow me to plant, but just not ideal. And maybe something we need to look for is that center brace. I'm like in love with the temperature right now. I could do this. I could suntan. As Canadian as I am, I could suntan. I'm a redhead, so I couldn't suntan, but like theoretically, I could burn out here. Okay, so now that we're inside, let's talk about the... Hi, I got a coffee delivery from Mr. Gardening Canada. Thank you. Okay, so here are the 5 things you should look for in a garden bed based on my experience to date. Technically, this video is sponsored by Vigo because they did send me a garden bed that I was hoping to set up before the snow flew, but then of course the snow came a little bit early and we didn't end up setting it up. So number 1 is material quality. So there are so many different types of metal out there, but the 2 to look for would be galvanized steel or stainless steel. Now the reason for this is because these are tough enough and tougher than something like aluminum, for example. So they won't bow as easily, they won't crumple under pressure as easily, and they are resistant to corrosion. Now these are obviously, particularly stainless steel is always used in the food industry, making it food safe for growing in, etc. and so forth. It's when we get into mixed metals or some oddities out there where we may risk some metal elements leaking in, but galvanized steel Technically, we could still get into some toxicity issues, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Next up is the coating. Yes, folks, the coating. So my stainless steel beds that I showed you from Princess Auto, those obviously are not coated. The fact that they're stainless steel is what ensures they don't rust or whatever the case is. Like I said, I've had those beds for about 3 years, and I don't have any rusting issues to date. Now, if you're going for galvanized steel or something a little bit different, you may want a powder coat, or if you just don't like the look of metal in your garden, which I can totally understand, you may want to go for something that is coated. So the Vigo is coated, and also the Sprout Box is coated. And with that, we want a high quality powder coating with maybe a clear coat on top. Now, you will be using trowels and metal objects inside of that bed, which is even a better reason to have proper powder coating and etc. and so forth, because when you scratch it, you expose the metal, which can cause rust, etc. and so forth. So personally, so far, I found Sprout Box to have a really good outside coating. Vigo touts a great powder coating as well. Definitely something you want to consider. So construction is definitely one of those things that you need to look out for when choosing a bed. So in the case of something that is angular and square or rectangle without the curved ends on it, you really want to make sure it has almost an octagon type feel to it, where the corners are flattened and braced appropriately to prevent those sides from buckling, such as what we see with my stainless steel beds in the front. Now, if you're going for something that's rounded or curved like the Sprout Box or the Vigo garden bed, you want to obviously ensure that if it's longer in nature, that the sides are properly reinforced, and or the metal itself is strong enough to prevent that bowing out. Now, one way you could technically get away with a taller bed and reduce bowing would be to put less moisture holding type material into the bed itself. So for example, with the Vigo I got, it's the taller model of it, which I was hoping to set up, and obviously snow prevented that, so here we are. But it will be going up the moment it begins to thaw outside. Essentially, with that Vigo bed, what I'm going to do, because it is taller in nature and I don't want it to buckle, not that I'm concerned that it will. These beds seem to be pretty hardy. A lot of people on Instagram use them. A lot of YouTubers use Vigo, and the construction seems as though they don't bow in the way that the other one I have outdoors, the Sprout Box, is doing. So what you would want to do is put in less dense material. Less dense meaning lower water holding capacity. The more water your soil, potting soil holds, the heavier the material becomes, and the more pressure it puts on the sides, kind of pulling or bowing out. So what you could do is you could put things like tree trunks, branches, leaf mold to an extent, that sort of thing in the bottom half of the container. Now, one thing to keep in mind is what kind of plants are you growing and what does their root do? So if you've got a large taproot plant that you intend to put in that bed, I would keep in mind that wherever your wood interfaces with your soil, there's going to be about 2 inches into that soil system that's going to be lackluster in nitrogen content, because the nitrogen is getting pulled from the microbes into helping decompose that lower wood area. And this is true for pretty much any wood that's not fully decomposed, regardless of how aged it is. Now, the more aged the wood is, the less nitrogen it pulls, but regardless, you're going to have some nitrogen loss in that first 2 inches of soil. So that means you could never fill up 3/4 of the bed, put soil on top, and expect stellar results from your plants. But what you could do is do 1/4, maybe half, and then put the rest as potting soil or soil, whatever you choose, and that would ultimately counteract that. Now, say you can't get around it, you absolutely have to put more wood debris in to be able to make up for that space. then what you would want to do is supplement with a liquid nitrogen fertilizer, organic or synthetic, doesn't really matter, to help offset the losses that happen in that 2-inch span. And you wouldn't notice the effects on, say, a lighter feeding plant, but you would notice the effects on like a sunflower or corn or tomatoes, things of that nature. I wouldn't expect to see much effect on like carrots or lettuce or herbs, that sort of thing. There's also just the 3-year rule that I use with all newly established garden beds, and that is it takes about 3 years for your potting soil to kind of turn it around. So what I mean by that is when you newly establish a garden bed, doesn't matter what kind it is, it usually takes about 3 years before you start to see quality produce from that bed. And that is solely because the soil is forming its structure. You're getting your microbes in place, or your rhizosphere is trying to engineer itself to be valuable to plants. And just in general, things are settling and working their way out. I just don't expect for about 3 years. I expect no great results out of those beds until they've settled and kind of done their thing. And I think a lot of people, Geek Crew, you could vouch for this, I'm sure, in the comments down below. 3 to 5 years is kind of like that sweet spot before any sort of garden bed, even in ground beds, begin to produce in a way that you want them to. So don't just give up because things don't look perfect the first year. They're not going to. Lastly is depth. Now, I've spoken about raised bed depth at length before. And generally speaking, if you have mobility issues, so like my little sister, for example, she is MS. And so her bending down, not ideal, wouldn't be a good thing. So you'd want something raised to a height in which is comfortable for you to work in. That aside, if you don't have mobility issues and you just want raised beds, because maybe you want to build on top of your soil or you don't want to rototill, whatever the case is, you need to consider your root biomass and what is underneath that soil. Now, for me personally, I can work with any soil. It could be clay, it could be sand, you name it, I'm gonna be just fine. So my stamp of approval is if you're gardening in mineral soil, the most height you need is about that much, like in and around there. That is it, that is all. If you're growing on top of cement or interlocking brick or asphalt or something that is not ideal for growing plants, anything that's not soil, and don't call dirt's not a thing, just so you know. But if you're growing on something that's hard, and by hard I mean cement-like, you may want to go higher, and that's when you run into around that 2 to 3 feet, if not taller. So I like to stay on the side of caution at 3 feet, particularly for like tomatoes and that sort of thing. And that's how high my bed is. And then when it comes to filling said beds, I will always tell you, and I might be biased as a soil scientist, but I will always tell you, mineral soil, hands down. Do not put compost in it. Do not put potting soil in it. Put in mineral soil and watch the magic happen. The moment you use mineral soil, you'll begin to realize that you don't need micronutrients and you don't need rock dust and all this other fancy stuff, because that is literally what soil is. It is literal rock dust. I could go into how soil is made in a separate video, but regardless, use soil. Soil is your friend, and that's what I would fill all of these beds with. Okay, so let's talk about heavy metals. Now, heavy metals are something that happens in many different environments, in many different cases, and it's not particular to just raised beds. We can find toxicity in general in plastic containers, for example, particularly ones that are not food safe. So one of the best ways to protect yourself is to look for certifications. You want to make sure that the website or the product is saying safe from heavy metals, low in contaminant or zero contaminant, whatever the case is. If you can get that sort of a certification from them, you should be safe. Now, with that being said, I would go for a larger brand named bed, such as Vigo, for example, over a no-name Amazon. And that is just for peace of mind, because anything made with metal can have contaminants. And I know that obviously Vigo can be more expensive, but for just peace of mind, it may be the route you want to go. Now, if you don't have exposed metal and you have powder coating, for example, again, the powder coating needs to be food safe. It needs to be contaminant free. So anything that's food safe means you are safe, but anything that's not listed as food safe, you could run into issues. If you are still concerned about this, you could always send your soil in for heavy metal contamination testing. Ultimately speaking, if there's contaminants in your soil, your plants are going to tell you first and foremost that there's contaminants in your soil, particularly if there's dangerous levels of them. So do keep that in mind. And having metal beds is not, you're not, like I said, restricted to just, that being the issue. Plastic has that issue. Nylon has that issue. Even wood beds can have that issue. We just need to be careful about which ones we're choosing. We always want to go for quality, reputable brands, preferably. And unfortunately, sometimes the ones with the higher price tag as much as we don't want to. In conclusion, steel beds, I personally love them. They last longer. And I mean, the Telegraph article, this one here, go watch my video on that if you want to learn more. It even said to choose beds like this to reduce your carbon footprint, because otherwise gardeners supposedly, according to this article, not according to me, gardeners produce more CO2 than farmers. So this is one way to reduce that kind of hate towards gardeners. Anyways, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. We'd love to have you here on the Geek Crew, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye.